So horrendous are the human and material costs of wars that many polities, considering a resort to force, have felt compelled to explain and defend their action to the individuals and groups called upon to bear those costs, to engage their wills and energies to justify their sacrifices and deprivations, and ultimately to persuade observers and posterity of the nobility of their cause. In constructing these defenses, advocates of the use of force have drawn upon religion, law, history, and accepted codes of civil behavior, and appealed to collective fears and resentments arising out of perceived political slights and supposed violations of customary rights and authority, to make the case that the war under consideration is both just and unavoidable. In a free society, however, I'm having a little trouble with this. These constructs are open to challenge from those who have and use political voice, and those challenges will mount quickly if the aims of war prove elusive and the costs reach insupportable levels. The justice or injustice of any war lies in the eye of the beholder. And the event that we are considering at this conference is no exception. In 1763, barely a dozen years before the event that contemporaries in Great Britain know as the American War, and American historians would subsequently label the War for American Independence, before that war broke out on April 19th, 1775 at Lexington and Concord, those who would become the belligerent parties on both the eastern and western sides of the Atlantic world would have laughed at any suggestion that the British Empire might at any point in the foreseeable future erupt in a civil war. Resounding British victories in the 7 Years' War on 3 continents and in the West Indies and on the high seas had brought Britain to vast new possessions in North America, the West Indies, Bengal, and the West African coast. And as authoritative celebrants, as enthusiastic celebrants throughout the British Empire proclaim, rendered it the largest and most successful empire in history up to that time. Because so much of the war had been fought in North America, and because most of the British continental colonies had made substantial contributions of men and money to the war effort, their inhabitants were happier than ever to be British, taking enhanced pride in their British heritage and seizing every occasion to express their long-standing affection for the metropolitan state and their connection to it. To be sure, wartime experiences had served to confirm a pre-existing concern among metropolitan authorities about their tenuous authority over their distant provinces that had, especially over the previous half-century, contributed so substantially to Britain's commercial and economic development and defensive capabilities through the consumption of British goods, through their heavy demand for African slaves, and their situation and their stimulation of the development of Britain's maritime resources. Specifically, widespread evasions of metropolitan trade laws during the war evoked demands for stricter enforcement, while the refusal of colonial legislatures to adhere to any restriction on their authority over their respective domestic affairs inspired demands for the new modeling of colonial governments. and the chicanery of Indian traders and the relentless encroachment of a prolific settler population upon Indian lands seemed, if peace were to be maintained on North American frontiers, to require metropolitan direction of both Indian affairs and territorial expansion. If a profound appreciation of the commercial utility of the colonies to Britain underlay such demands, few, if any, of the advocates for such measures expected that the colonists had any capacity or the will, the cohesion or the disaffection to mount any serious resistance to them, especially not when the metropolis had a sizable military contingent scattered through many of the colonies and a powerful navy to help enforce its directives. For scholars of this post-7 Years' War era, the paramount questions have always been how and why, over the mere dozen years afterwards, this manifest colonial affection for Britain could break down to the point that those who favored using force to defend the colonies from British measures that they interpreted as denials of their inherited rights could carry the day and rather quickly turn their resistance into a movement for independence from their formerly revered parent state. For historians of the late 18th century, Britain and the British Empire, the central questions have been how and why, over the same period, the British political nation, notwithstanding its manifest appreciation of the commercial and strategic utility of the colonies to the parent state, persisted in a policy that led to colonial alienation and provoked a bloody civil war, in which proponents of force on both sides of the Atlantic fervently believed that justice was on their side. What historians on both sides have often missed or inadequately taken into account is that a substantial population in the British political nation and a sizable population in America opposed the use of force, lamented the degeneration of an imperial family disagreement into a bloody civil war among fellow nationals, and decried the unnatural, the fratricidal character of such a conflict and the high costs and injustices it produced. The debate leading up to and continuing throughout the war thus involved not two, but four differing perspectives on the question of whether or not the war was a just one. My contention here is that any discussion of the American Revolution as a just war needs to include a consideration of all four of these perspectives. Accordingly, in this lecture, I'll examine the intensive debates in Britain over the legitimacy of using force against fellow subjects, and less fully in the colonies over the legitimacy of resisting that force and of coercing provincial populations into complying with the resistance, mainly through an analysis of the extensive pamphlet literature published on the American question in Britain, which was 5 times the amount of literature published on the same question in the colonies. But mainly through that, I will and reports of parliamentary debates, I will consider both the issues and considerations that drove those debates and rationales developed to justify the opposite or oppose the drift to and continuation of war. In Britain, the massive resistance of the American colonies during the Stamp Act crisis and their explicit denial of parliamentary authority to tax and legislate for the internal domestic affairs of the colonies effectively split the political nation into two general contending political persuasions, each containing many myriad variations. On two essential points, they did not disagree. First, that Parliament's authority to legislate for the colonies was full and complete. And second, that the economic and strategic value of the colonies to Britain required that they remain within the British Empire. But they disagreed profoundly about the best strategy to secure the colonial connection, one persuasion advocating coercion and the other conciliation. Thoroughly outraged by the extent, vigor, and character of colonial resistance, the coercionists opposed any modification of the Stamp Act, were appalled by proposals for its repeal, and demanded a swift and effective exertion of metropolitan authority to enforce it. For them, the solemn petitions and strident resolutions adopted by colonial legislatures denying Parliament's authority over the internal affairs of free British polities in America, and the many other examples of colonial resistance to the Stamp Act, exhibited a flagrant disregard for metropolitan authority and levels of ingratitude, disloyalty, and dissatisfaction with metropolitan restraints that fell but little short of outright rebellion, and expressed long smoldering aspirations for total colonial independence from the parent state. As one coercionist explained it, to accede to colonial demands would make Americans our masters, and declared, another analyst, Great Britain nothing more than a province to her own colonies. Nor was the use of force missing from the agenda of advocates of this persuasion. Many talk boldly about compelling the execution of the Stamp Act by force of arms, and reckon that a mere thousands of our regular troops could easily drive all the colonies before them. Our newspapers and coffeehouse politicians, an advocate for a more conciliatory approach, complained in early 1776, have been lately full of invectives against the disposition and conduct of the Americans, and using foul-mouthed reproach, accused them of insolently claiming an independency and declared them guilty of treason and thoroughly deserving to be treated as rebels. Advocating the most violent methods, they seem to be endeavoring to drive matters to the worst and last extremity, a civil war that would be immediately entered into and pursued with rigor and vengeance against Britain's very own descendants and subjects. Merely by standing up for their liberty, the colonists, lamented still other writers, other writers opposed to extreme retaliatory measures, had succeeded only in unleashing Britannia's hate to such an extent that a golden fury rages in every breast. Branding the advocates of coercion as enemies to the peace and prosperity of this nation, those favoring conciliation argued that as fellow subjects, colonists ought to be treated with tenderness and liberality, and urged Parliament to approach the critical situation we are in with deliberation and an air of goodwill, not rashness and violence, contending that the principal objective of Britain in sponsoring colonizing schemes had been the establishment and extension of the commerce of all the British dominions. They queried whether levying taxes upon them was not entirely contrary to sound policy, and called upon Parliament to consider the colony's prominent role in enriching and strengthening Britain and the loyal disposition they had always displayed toward it. So far from deserving metropolitan disrespect as a set of vagabonds and transports, as so many advocates of coercion had asserted, the colonists, conciliationists argued, had brought their respective provinces into a respectable importance and deserve recognition as an industrious, honest, and free people, declaring that it was bad policy in free states to treat their colonies with severity. Exponents of conciliation contended that Britain had established colonies to create a dominion founded on freedom, not an uncontrollable power over slaves. Especially in view of the colonists' unanimous expression through their remonstrances of their assemblies, of their settled determination not to submit to the Stamp Act, they cautioned against measures that, through injury or oppression, might produce further resentments and advocated modifications or repeal of the Stamp Act. Not abject submission, but wise and proper management designed to encourage a liberal obedience and filial affection, and following the Irish model, a very cautious exercise of parliamentary authority, were the best means to restore colonial respect for that authority and the colonies and retain the colonies within the imperial orbit and promote their gradual assimilation to the British state. For people of this persuasion, the use of force was completely inappropriate. In early 1766, one author produced an entire pamphlet warning of the consequence of enforcing obedience by military measures, asking his readers whether the terror of arms had ever convinced the judgment and conciliated the affections, and whether the Americans can or will ever be cordially united to her if moderation, the best means of governing, is called pusillanimity and looked upon as below the dignity of authority. Although he thought it probable that Great Britain would at last be triumphant in any military altercation, he provided a long history of the successful Netherlands revolt against Spain in the late 16th and early 17th century to alert readers to the possibility that Britain's most vigorous efforts may be baffled, notwithstanding the greatness of her power and the weakness of America. Every war is doubtful, he observed, power having frequently ruined itself by confidence and weakness grown strong by despair. The repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766, during the few months in which, during the whole of the 1760s and 1770s, such moderates were in control of Parliament, represented a victory for the forces of conciliation, as to a lesser extent did the partial repeal of the Townshend duties in 1771. At the same time, however, continuing resistance in the late 1760s and early 1770s only served to deepen the convictions of advocates for repression that the repeal of the Stamp Act had been a huge mistake, that the colonies, especially New England, were dominated by turbulent politicians who were aiming at independence, and that decades of metropolitan neglect had fostered the development of such sentiments, as well as of the groundless constitutional arguments that colonials employed to justify colonial resistance. Colonial resistance to the Tea Act of 1773 powerfully reinforced such sentiments, inaugurated a new phase in the debate over the use of force, and contributed to the demand for strong measures to bring the colonies to obedience. Thus, the avowed intention of the metropolitan government in the Coercive Acts of 1774, after the Boston Tea Party, was to make an example of Massachusetts Bay, unilaterally closing the port of Boston and changing the Massachusetts Constitution and the system for the administration of justice. Through the imposition of a naval blockade of Boston, these measures represented the first instance of government-mandated force against any of the colonies. While the administration stopped short of actually authorizing the use of an extensive military establishment stationed in Boston to quell colonial resistance, neither the government nor its supporters exhibited much interest in conciliation. And the colonists' widespread and wholesale resistance to the Coercive Acts, in particular their calling of a Continental Congress that laid out the case for the unconstitutionality of those acts and sanctioned the continental boycott of British imports and military preparations to combat any metropolitan efforts to force colonial compliance, produced a groundswell of opinion in Britain in favor of naval and military coercion. Denying that taxation was tyranny, refusing to consider any colonial petitions challenging the authority of Parliament to legislate for all British dominions, assigning all responsibility for the controversy to colonial resistance to that authority, and glowing with a spirit of revenge, coercionists justified the resort to force primarily on grounds of necessity and honor. Can it be thought that Great Britain, whose government has been insulted, whose constitutional supremacy has been denied, whose dominions have been invaded, ask another government spokesman, will crouch the subjects in rebellion? Can Englishmen wish to see their country so far degraded as to make ignominious concessions under such multiplied instances of provocation? Considerations of expediency, striking while the colonies were still too weak and divided to resist British military and naval forces, and of utility, maintaining Britain's ability to continue to subordinate colonial economies to the commercial interests of the metropolis, also informed the decision to employ force. Considerations of justice, however, were marginal to the government case. Even Alexander Carlyle's 1777 pamphlet, The Justice and Necessity of War with Our American Colonies Examined, the only pamphlet, incidentally, to foreground the word justice in its title, was principally concerned with arguing for the necessity of war. This observation is not to suggest that proponents of war in any way question the justice of their advocacy, but only that the point seemed to be too obvious to be made. Such was not the case among the large conciliationist minority who mounted a substantial and extended critique of the resort to force, both in and out of Parliament, a critique that they kept up from 1774 until the loss of an army at Yorktown and the heavy physical costs of the war drove the North administration out of power in 1782. Pointing out in detail the uncertainties of the outcome of any war and the difficulties of controlling a conquered territory of such large extent as the continental colonies, conciliationists blamed successive administrations for the provocations that led to the controversy. Ignoring both the commercial and libertarian principles upon which the empire had been constructed, one ministry after another, they charged, had undertaken new plans for our old colonies that revealed a total unacquaintance with the true spirit of commerce and can only be seen by the colonists in the invidious light of innovations, but that would deprive them of the traditional liberties they had all along enjoyed. Before the era of the fatal Stamp Act, said Henry Cuvier in Parliament in restating a line of argument to which the conciliationists had long adhered, no country had been more happy in its colonies than Great Britain. Connected to Britain by mutual interests, the empire had flourished in an intercourse of amity, protection, and obedience, and it exhibited no instance of a disobedience to your laws, no denial of the jurisdiction of Parliament, no marks of jealousy and discontent. Moreover, as many adherents of this position observed, the proponents of war severely underestimated the breadth, depth, and character of American resistance. Only one common principle and a persuasion of right, said one writer, could have brought a people so divided and living most happily and sensible of it to make so general an opposition to a nation which they loved, expose an extended sea course to the most formidable naval power, and a straggling frontier to savages and Canadians, and the habitations of the most wealthy colonies to the ravages of their own slaves. Arguing that resistance was not rebellion, and decrying the idea that Britain, the land of liberty, should ever desire to hold her empire under a forced subjection, the opponents of war condemned it both as a violation of the civilized norms of familial attachment, mother against children, brother against brother, but also as inhumane and unjust. The ministry's measures of blood, distress, and ruin decried the Manasseh Dawes has been designed the better to slaughter our fellow creatures, employ our army and navy, and promote desolation in the once quiet houses of a useful and prosperous people. Conciliationist writers found proposals for the use of Indians, slaves, Russians, and Germans against Americans particularly inhumane. Only the certain and indubitable justice of the cause declared an anonymous conciliation in the spring of 1776 could possibly authorize war. And he observed, if it cannot be determined that the colonies are wrong, neither it can be determined that ministry are right. And in defiance of every pervasive influence, this nation is at least divided in opinion on the matter. Men who are conscious that they have the worst of the argument decline reasoning and have recourse to blows. And ministry, after their example, reject reasoning and assume the sword. Then follow violence and rapine unrestrained, though no ways conducive to the main end and design, that end being for Britain to retain its profitable relationship with all its colonies. Those colonists who favored resistance could not have agreed more about the injustice of Britain's use of force to compel the colonies to submit to parliamentary authority. Meeting on November 10th, 1775, less than a month after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress, initially composed of delegates from the 12 colonies from South Carolina north to New Hampshire, found itself confronted with the joint problems of organizing and explaining colonial resistance to the force of the imperial state. In addition to authorizing a continental army with George Washington at its head, it produced a series of state papers intended to set forth the justice of the colonial cause. The most important for our purposes being a declaration by the representatives of the United Colonies of North America, setting forth the causes and necessity of taking up arms. Collectively, these documents supply a succinct and authoritative statement of the colonial rationale for a forceful response to British military provocations. Deeply lamenting the convulsions that were then shaking the British Empire to its deepest foundations, these documents flatly contradicted metropolitan charges that the colonies had any ambitious designs of separating from Great Britain, establishing independent states, dissolving the union that had so long and so happily subsisted between us, or challenging Parliament's jurisdiction over trade and other external affairs of the empire. Rather, they presented colonial actions as a necessary and appropriate response to the astonishing and indisputable truth that at this enlightened period, the leaders of a nation, which in every age has sacrificed hecatombs of her bravest patriots on the altar of liberty, should presume gravely to establish an arbitrary sway over the lives, liberties, and properties of their fellow subjects in America. Taking the historical approach that had characterized colonial resistance from the mid-1760s, the writers of these documents explain that the colonists, colonial forefathers, the real founders of America, by the way, had voluntarily immigrated from Britain without state assistance, and by their unceasing labor had effected settlements in the distant and inhospitable wilds of America, then filled with numerous and warlike nations of barbarians, where, in their respective jurisdictions, they had formed perfect legislatures and substantially contributed to the construction of a harmonious relationship with England that in a short time became so mutually beneficial as to bring about an amazing increase in the wealth, strength, and navigation of the realm, and to enable the colonies to make major contributions to Britain's mid-18th century imperial wars. Expecting to have a share in the blessings of peace and the emoluments of victory and conquest at the end of the 7 Years' War, the colonies instead found themselves subjected to a new system of statutes and regulations for the administration of the colonies that called into question their entitlement to numerous rights that they had peacefully enjoyed for near 2 centuries, a system that was the design of a new group of ministers who judged the colonies to be susceptible to the easy emoluments of statutable plunder, and who had persuaded Parliament to adopt the pernicious project of taxing the colonists without their consent, and thereby deprive them of their ancient exclusive right to dispose of their own property. As these documents explain, these meditated innovations had filled colonial minds with the most painful fears and jealousies, and for the next decade, the colonies, in a vain effort to persuade metropolitan leaders to acknowledge their rights, had incessantly and ineffectually besieged the throne as supplicants and remonstrated with Parliament in the most mild and decent language, a strategy that they continued to follow in protesting the coercive acts in 1774, when the First Continental Congress had adopted only most temperate and respectful petitions and retaliated only with the peaceable admonition of breaking off all commercial intercourse with Britain. But the Crown, the writers lamented, had been deaf to their complaints, while Parliament, stimulated by an inordinate passion for power and blinded by their intemperate rage for unlimited domination, had ignored colonial petitions, declared Massachusetts to be in rebellion, and all the other colonies to be involved in unlawful combinations and engagements, and despite eloquent opposition from illustrious and numerous groups in both houses of Parliament, directed the Crown to take the most effectual measures to enforce the obedience to the laws and authority of the Supreme Legislature. By sending large reinforcements of ships and troops and Britain's 3 most experienced generals to Boston, the administration had clearly signaled its intention to employ Britain's military and naval resources to enforce metropolitan authority in the resisting colonies by waging war with their fellow subjects. Acting under administration orders, General Thomas Gage had taken possession of Boston, turned it into a garrison town, the first garrison town in the colonies, by the way, and sent a large detachment of his army to make an unprovoked assault on the inhabitants of Lexington and Concord, where, before driven back to Boston by an enraged populace, they killed several colonials. Soon thereafter, Gage had declared martial law and used his utmost power to spread destruction and devastation, burning Charleston, seizing ships, and intercepting supplies and provisions. At the same time, after other British officials in America were proposing further refinements in parental cruelty, General Guy Carleton in Canada instigating Canadians and Indians to deluge our settlements with the blood of innocent women and children, and officials elsewhere reportedly plotting to encourage colonial slave uprisings. Such actions, the writers declared, had compelled us to arm in our defense, denying that God had ever intended a part of the human race to hold an absolute property in and an unbounded power over others, or for those others to become objects of a legal domination never rightfully resistible, however severe and oppressive, and disavowing any interpretation of the British Imperial Constitution that gives a freedom to a part but necessarily enslaves the remainder of the empire. The writers expressed certainty that these British who had made the decision to use force to achieve their ends were entirely responsible for starting the war, and that colonial resistance to it was just. Of course, not all colonial resistance perceived much justice in this defense of the colonial cause. Although they did not manage to achieve much public voice until the crisis of 1774 and 75, many people from the Stamp Act crisis on had opposed resistance on a number of grounds. In various combinations, these dissidents, echoing many of the themes of metropolitan coercionists and adding others, objected that resistance leaders, including the elected assemblies, were wrong on the nature of the imperial constitution, that resistance to metropolitan authority was ungrateful, undutiful, and disloyal, that the self-appointed groups, the Sons of Liberty, the Committees of Safety, the provisional legislatures, and the Congress that led and enforced the resistance had no constitutional legitimacy and represented a usurped authority that repeatedly violated the rule of law and individual liberty and property by stifling dissent, persecuting and threatening the lives, and destroying the property of those who challenged or defied their authority. That such massive civil resistance was the route to political and social chaos, and after Britain had turned to force in 1775, that the colonies were too disunited, dissimilar, weak, and lacking in leadership, common interests, political and military resources, expertise, sophistication, and social capital, in other words, too provincial, to have any chance of success against the most powerful naval, military, and commercial power in the world. However, in contrast to the situation in Britain, where the tradition of a loyal opposition promoted, or permitted anyway, open and intense debate over government policy, the colonial dissidents who held these views had, unlike the advocates of resistance, neither the political leverage nor the institutional platform to give them collective force. As dissident protests circulated in Britain, administration spokesmen condemned the violent intimidation of and unexampled brutalities and cruelties toward individuals suspected of preferring the king's government as brutal, reprehensible, and unjust, castigating American rebels for their savagery in tarring and feathering those who opposed the resistance movement, a species of torture they denounced as both shocking to humanity and a blatant departure from the rule of law. For metropolitan coercionists, American repression of those who opposed resistance thus supplied additional justification for engaging in war to put down colonial rebellion. For the people who fell into these four camps, two of them coercionists and two conciliationists, the violence, human and physical costs and length of the war operated to harden their divisions over how far to go and what strategies to use to achieve their respective objectives. Until the colonial resistance committed the colonies to independence in late 1775 and 1776, all four camps showed a desire to keep the empire together. And victorious Americans could view the outcome of the war as a vindication of the justice of their cause. But the end of the war produced few visible signs among coercionists in Britain that they regretted their choice to use force. Indeed, many of them, including those disaffected Americans who had suffered such heavy losses during the war and had fled to Britain or to other British places, pushed strongly for its continuation, even after Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown, while conciliationists remained persuaded that milder measures would have held the empire together. Neither conciliationists nor coercionists can be said to have displayed particular foresight. Contrary to the conciliationists, a divorce with the former colonies did not produce a dissolution of the British Empire, nor the Parliament, nor the permanent loss of American trade, nor the destruction of the domestic British economy. Contrary to coercionists, the loosely connected coalition of dissimilar polities that came together in 1774 and 76 turned into a lasting union. I've long thought that British coercionists should be accorded a place in the among the founders of the nation that came into being as an unintended consequence of their resort to military measures. The Continental Congress's precise description of itself in its declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms as the 12 united colonies reminds us that the United States did not exist when the colonies first came together and went to war. Before Congress could speak on behalf of these United States, it had to invent a nation by that name, which it did in the Declaration of Independence, thanks to our unwitting British founders. Throughout the war, analysts of all persuasions addressed the knotty question that Dr. John Roebuck, a coercionist pretending to impartiality, asked in the title of a pamphlet published in the spring of 1776, whether the guilt of the present Civil War in America ought to be imputed to Great Britain or America. In its very articulation, this question hints that the war generated a high level of disquiet within the wider Anglophone world, and that disquiet deserves the kind of serious historical investigation that the authors of the papers presented at this conference are giving to it. From our long temporal distance and scrupulous disciplinary detachment, we can see that in a world without an impartial arbiter, the justice of wars, civil and international, depends upon the side on which a group finds itself. In the case of the American Revolution, all four sets of contemporaries regarded their behavior as just and understandable. And who are we to say otherwise? And why should we? Thank you.